neutral about those identities. It's not passive and hands-off. It is, to use Joe Caron's very apt phrase, even-handed in how it deals with identities rather than hands-off. And that group accommodation of these, what I refer to as identity communities, and this is perhaps a point worth stressing, this last point. If we think about the kinds of groups like, let's say, African Caribbeans in Britain, okay, so this is not a religious group. The point I want to make is that multicultural equality is typically about groups which combine agency and a certain givenness, what I've called a socialized givenness. Socialized in the sense either of external ascription, where people are told, you know, you are black, because there's some kind of an ideology that ascribes those identities to people, usually, of course, an ideology of domination, you know, racism of some sort or other, or because people themselves say, we're black and we want to be respected. You know, we're black and proud. Black is beautiful. We don't want your negative images demeaning us. We want a public space that does not demean us. Now, why I say this combines these two things is because one argument that people use for which, like say Brian Barry, you know, a well-known liberal political philosopher, because it would, as it were, kill multicultural equality at its very first step. Not multicultural equality, sorry, the kinds of arguments I want to make in relation to religious accommodation. It's because he says, well, but religion's got nothing to do with the kinds of groups about whom we're concerned with, you know, egalitarians should be concerned with, because people choose their religion. Whereas these identities, race, sex, sexuality, are not chosen. We are just given them. Above all, we're given them biologically. They are what some people call identities of fate. And I think that's a very oversimplistic view. That's what I mean by saying, actually, there's a combination of agency and givenness. Because just because your parents are of African descent doesn't mean that you're committed to the teaching of African history in British schools. You might say, well, what's that got to do with me? I don't want to know about that. Can we have some extra IT lessons? Or can we learn about China and have lessons in Mandarin, because that's what I need to know. Don't tell me about Africa. You know, you look at my black skin and you assume I need to know something about Africa. I don't, and I don't want to. There's nothing incoherent about that. We all understand that. And if we understand that, we also understand its opposite, namely where people say, I want to know my history. Why can't British schools tell me about something about my history and how it relates to Britain, to how you and I and we all came together? That's part of the island story we need to know about, including all its rough periods like slavery and so on. But if that's the case, then that's chosen. People don't want to know about African history just because of their biology, because we know black people who don't want to know about African history. So that's why I say there's an element of givenness and choice. And I want to say actually that the religious identities I'm interested in, and the ones I'm most centrally interested in, is, you know, with Western European Muslim identities, they're exactly the same. They involve an element of agency and choice, and they involve an element of socialized givenness. Nobody chooses to be born into a Muslim family any more than you choose to be, you know, born black or yellow or, you know, anything else. So that's the kind of thing I wanted to say about multiculturalism, and probably may have needed to say more, but I want to get on with the rest of the lecture, which mainly consists of me engaging with two objections to my view, and I've kind of only partly set out my view because I want to elaborate my view further by dealing with these two objections. The first objection is an objection of principle, and the second objection is an objection of kind of pragmatic politics. And the first objection is that I'm in breach, and what I'm suggesting, I'm in breach of the liberal requirement of state neutrality, because following Rawls's influence on liberalism, where he argued that the liberal state or the just state must be neutral between all conceptions of the good. All liberals, or well, a lot of academic liberals, take the view that how can you have a state identifying, openly identifying with one religion? That's not neutrality. Liberals should be neutral on matters to do with conceptions of the good. Now, I have a quite complex and multi-layered answer to this. My first part of my answer is, if by neutral is meant that a state should have no religious character, well, there's no such thing as cultural contentlessness. The state will always have some historical cultural character, and so no state can be neutral on matters of culture. For example, the official language, or even languages, you know, obviously here we are with 2 official languages, but it's 2, not 200, and they're not arbitrarily chosen. We didn't just say, well, let's have 2 languages. What about Swahili and Mandarin? The state is not neutral in the languages that it chooses, and the business of the state is conducted in these languages. It provides the rhetoric and the images in which people understand each other and identify with the state, or don't identify with it but contest that alienation, that failure of identification, or try to change it in some way. So, you know, no state is neutral if it has to use a language, and it goes much deeper than just language. States, societies all have certain specific historical, ethical, political and legal traditions. So there will always be some particularity. And I want to say this particularity, moreover, extends to the ways in which the state-religion connection is expressed. Sometimes it can be substantial, like the bishop in the House of Lords, or it can be symbolic, like prayers in Parliament, or the cross in the Quebec Provincial Assembly, and so on. But there will always be some cultural character. So if that's your meaning of neutrality, it's just impossible. Well, most liberals don't mean that when they mean neutrality. But, before I come to that, one objection some people have made is they say, in fact, Will Kimlicka has made this objection. He says, but language is essential. We couldn't have a society, we certainly couldn't have any politics without language. But he says, religion is optional. We all know we can have societies without religion, and perhaps we will one day, but there's nothing difficult to conceive about that. So it may be impossible to conceive a polity without a language, and therefore states can't be neutral about which languages they choose, but they can be neutral about religion because religions are optional. Well, my response to that is that actually states support all kinds of things quite normally and typically and non-controversially, which are optional. We have just supported the Olympics a few months ago, spent loads of money and time and energy and what have you. Well, we didn't have to. No one made us. We are actually delighted that we could. Most countries fight tooth and nail to have this option. And that's just one example. I mean, supporting the motor industry, or supporting opera, or supporting research into biotechnologies, all these are optional, and the state does them. We don't say, how can you be neutral, or you should be neutral here. You shouldn't support the motor car industry, because what about all the people who are relying on the motor car industry going bust so that they can build trains? Or if you support this form of energy, you're disadvantaging those people who would like to work in the nuclear industry. You know, if you're supporting tidal wave energy creation or something. So actually, there has to be some specific argument about religion. The argument from neutrality is just too big. It doesn't work because we know the states will be non-neutral. That is just a fact of life. Okay, so then we get to what is the more principled argument that liberals really have in mind. And that is, if by neutrality is meant not cultural contentlessness, but that the basic structure of the state, so I'm now moving to the second bullet point, right? The basic structure of the state and its laws and policies must be derived from, or can only be justified by reference to certain principles. And these principles are ones that must be wider than identification with one religion. So of course the background idea very much comes from Rawls, what he calls a political conception of justice. And bearing in mind that Rawls was ruling out not just appeals to religion, but to all comprehensive doctrines, which of course includes, you know, political ideologies and so on, then I think, yes, okay, I think state-religious connections can be consistent with liberal democratic constitutionalism. That's how I'm interpreting this Rawlsian idea of political conception of justice, with two qualifications. Firstly, we must not assume that political justice in this basic sense is cut and dried, that the principles are only consistent with a narrow set of comprehensive doctrines and susceptible to a narrow set of meanings. I think Charles Taylor offers a capacious understanding of the Rawlsian idea of overlapping consensus, but Taylor makes it bigger and flexible, or if you're of the opposite bent, he makes it looser and flabbier. But I think, yeah, looser and flabbier is the way you have to go. Though of course I call it here a flexible and dialogical way of reinterpreting the core principles of political justice and of how they may be implemented. And I think Veit-Baader points out that this neutrality is actually best understood as liberal democratic constitutionalism. So I prefer to call it that than to use any Rawlsian phrase. And of course, it has a substantive political content, so it's not empty. In that sense, it's not neutral. But that's fine. Rawls's political conception of justice, in that sense, also has substantive principles. Okay, so that's my first qualification. That is, we mustn't have too narrow a conception of what the liberal principles are, that any liberal state has to be consistent with, because we're constantly arguing about them and reinterpreting them and so on. And I say, well, if you give me that proviso, and I'm going to ask for one more proviso, if you give me those, then yes, state-religion connections can be shown to be consistent with liberal neutrality. And secondly, this is the second thing I'm asking for, is that if we assume that liberal democratic constitutionalism is a baseline or a core that we want all politics and political institutions to work from, including state-religion connections, it means that the state cannot subtract from LDC, liberal democratic constitution. It cannot be less than liberal democratic constitutionalism. It does not mean that the just state cannot build on liberal democratic constitutions. Indeed, that is exactly what it must do. So on my understanding of neutrality, you know, qualified in the way I've just said, i.e. something you can't be less than, but you can be more than, the state can identify with one or more comprehensive doctrines. You know, in this sense, I'm going against Rawls. It can identify with one or more comprehensive doctrines, and it can pursue socio-political projects. For example, the elimination of poverty. A state may commit itself to that, and some states have. Some states have said rhetorically they have and they haven't, but we all recognize that states can do so. In fact, many of us in the room may support that. Say, what a good idea. We don't want the state to be neutral about poverty. Or the state can decide, as J.F. Kennedy did in 1960 or 61, that he was committing the American state to putting a man on the moon. And a lot of people rejoiced. Obviously it had its critics, but a lot of people said, what a good idea, let's do it. That's nothing to do with liberal democratic constitutionalism. But it's consistent with liberal democratic constitutionalism. If he said, I'm going to put a man on the moon, and actually it needs so many resources, which I think Congress won't give me, I'm going to suspend Congress for 10 years, we might say, hey, hang on a minute, no, you can't do that. But if you work within liberal democratic constitutionalism, then what's wrong with saying, I'm committing this